Good afternoon, folks. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jimmy Bashar with the ISO Stakeholder Affairs Group, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the EIM Governance Review Committee formation meeting. At this time, I'd like to introduce my colleagues in the room with me here today. Being to my left,
Nikki Imam,
Bert Gross,
Peter Calusi,
Stacy Crowley.
Thanks, folks. Our agenda for today, after the introduction, as you can see, is to discuss the introductory comments and overview, followed, of course, by a review of the draft final proposal and charter, and, of course, next steps. As you may know, here is a simple display of our stakeholder process, during which we obtain feedback from you in between each proposal iteration prior to carrying the initiative forward to our board and EIM governing body for consideration for approval. In addition, as you may know, our calls and webinars are recorded for stakeholder convenience, allowing those who are unable to attend to listen to recordings after the meeting. The recordings will be publicly available on the ISO webpage for a limited time following the meeting. Of course, the recordings and any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without ISO's permission. And lastly, of course, if you have any questions, please press #2 to enter the queue. And please, of course, state the name and the company that you represent. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Peter.
All right. Well, thank you, Jimmy, for that great introduction, and thank you, stakeholders, for taking time out of your busy schedules to take part in this call today. What we're going to do here is give you a little introduction and overview of what we'd like to cover today. We kicked off this process on December 14th with an issue paper, followed by the April 1st draw proposal and draft charter for the formation of the Governance Review Committee, which we currently and frequently refer to as the GRC. In response to that straw proposal, we received written comments from a diverse set of stakeholders in California and in the West. These comments expressed broad support for both establishing the GRC and the proposed stakeholder-based process to nominate and rate candidates to serve on it. With that being said, recommendations for commenters are addressed in this presentation, the draft final proposal, and the stakeholder matrix that we posted on May 21st. Today, I'll primarily focus on changes we made to the draft final proposal in light of stakeholder comments in three main areas. The first being the role of the committee in the scope of work, the second, the process for establishing committee membership, and third, the operation of the committee. We're going to go ahead and walk through all of these changes, and then we'll open it up for question and answers after we discuss them. So the first one we're going to talk about here are the changes to the straw proposal. And we've kind of broken these out into a few different sections. The first is the role of the committee and the scope of work. The charter has a very broad scope that advises the GRC to consider potential revisions to the current EIM governance structure in light of the experience to date and the evolution of the EIM since its start in November of 2014. It also makes sure that this role would include potential revisions needed for an extended day-ahead market if there are sufficient benefits and interests and the ISO moves forward with developing the EDM market design. There was general support for this scope of work. However, we did make two revisions to this section of the charter based on the comments that we received. The first is that we clarified that scope of the GRC work. A concern was expressed that the language of the draft charter could be viewed as a mandatory direction that the GRC avoid proposals that involve more fundamental changes to EIM governance, even if such changes are deemed necessary. The language is not intended to limit the scope. It was meant to be optional guidance that a new model may not be required. In other words, the GRC should seek, if possible, to build upon and revise the existing structure. The language was not intended to rule out any proposal that the GRC may be willing to make. We have proposed a revision to the section of the draft tariff to clarify this intent. The second area is the timeline approximation has been extended. There were also several commenters that raised concerns that the period of time identified by the ISO for the GRC to complete its work may be overly ambitious, especially considering the scope of topics they will likely address. We recognize that the estimated timeline may not be enough, especially since the GRC will be developing its proposal through an iterative stakeholder process. We've revised the draft charter to refer to an estimated 6 to 12-month period for the GRC to complete its work. It's important to note that this estimate does not impose a hard cap for the amount of time it will take for the process to conclude. It's worth mentioning that we also didn't change some portions of the scope. Although several commenters did identify particular governance topics or proposals that the GRC should consider in its review, we've not proposed any revisions to the charter to specifically identify any topics such as those. While they do fall within the GRC's territory to consider, we believe that the general scope of work is broad enough, as it's currently written, to allow the GRC to consider these matters. With that being said, stakeholders are encouraged to bring these governance-related issues forward in comments when the GRC commences its work and seeks stakeholder input on the topics it should be considering. Now down to the next session, the process for establishing committee membership. Stakeholders overall expressed general support for the proposed approach for establishing membership of the GRC, but several refinements were suggested. The first is about the role of the Board of Governors, the EIM governing body, and the body of state regulators. A number of the commenters suggested that while it is appropriate for these members to serve on the GRC, they should not be voting members and instead should participate in an advisory role. We agree with those comments and have revised the draft charter so that each of these three members would serve in a non-voting advisory capacity. The next section is on stakeholder sector definitions. We're also making a change in the charter regarding the stakeholder sector definitions. The April 1st paper proposed 5 sectors that would be used for the process of nominating and ranking candidates to serve on the GRC. These definitions were closely modeled on the sectors currently used to nominate and rank candidates for the service on the EIM governing body. Our main objective is to establish sectors made up of entities that have sufficiently common membership and interest to be able to provide input on potential candidates for the GRC. The sectors should include stakeholders who have expressed an acceptable degree of commitment to the EIM to justify their direct involvement in selecting the committee. The concerns raised by commenters about sector membership suggest that it would be better to have entities that have not yet made a formal commitment to join participate in their own sector, rather than being grouped into sectors that include EIM entities and balancing authorities that have already signed EIM implementation agreements. Along these lines, we've also revised the draft charter to create an additional sector that we've named the pending new EIM participant sector. That includes any balancing authority that's entered into a formal public process to consider joining the EIM and the utilities or other entities that are located within such a balancing authority. We've also proposed revisions to the other sector definitions to make clear that such entities are removed from the EIM entities and the publicly owned utility sectors. The next section is the criteria used to select members and rules for sector nominations. Several commenters suggest that the ISO should consider adding more specific language to the charter to guide the makeup of the GRC, such as an obligation that the GRC have at least one member from each of those sectors charged with the nominating candidates. On that account, we have not made such changes out of a concern that imposing more rigid requirements risks undermining the ability of the EIM governing body and the board to weigh all of the various competing considerations in developing the GRC. Similarly, we have not adopted the recommendation that the stakeholder sector should be allowed to nominate fewer than 3 individuals as candidates for the GRC. If multiple sectors were to nominate only 1 or 2 candidates, the EIM governing body and the board may not have an adequately broad and diverse pool of candidates to be able to meet all the criteria established in the charter. However, we acknowledge this concern, and to address some of these comments, we've also added additional language to the draft charter, recognizing that an individual may be nominated by more than one sector. There was another portion that we did not change, and that was in regards to the committee size. We have proposed a total committee membership of 11 to 13 members. Several commenters suggest the ISO consider increasing the size of the GRC to allow for greater participation and diversity of viewpoints. We have not incorporated an increase in the size of the GRC due to the logistical challenges that a larger membership would create. Because each GRC member will not be responsible for voting for their own narrow interests or representing the interests of a single sector, it's best to focus on establishing a broadly representative committee rather than ensuring a specific number of seats are set aside for any given stakeholder sector or a set of sectors. And now we're going to move on to the operation of the committee. The rules governing how the GRC will operate are outlined in the draft charter. These rules, which are generally modeled on the Transitional Committee Charter, received minimal stakeholder comment, and in this way appear to have general stakeholder support. Except for on the minority opinion here, which I'm going to discuss. One topic that did receive comment was this section of the draft charter requiring that a minority opinion must have at least 3 supporting votes in support in order to be submitted along with the majority proposal to the EIM governing body and the ISO board. Several commenters suggested that the minimum number of supporting votes be either reduced or eliminated. We believe that there is a value to have such a provision and have revised the draft charter to reduce the required minimum number of supporting votes from 3 to 2. And now we're going to take that to slide 5, Jimmy. To drag this home, thank you. As we mentioned in the May 21st draft final proposal, we're asking stakeholders to submit any comments by no later than June 11th. As stated here on the slide, comments may be submitted in writing to initiativecomments@CAISO.com. It is worth noting, however, stakeholders are not required to submit any comments unless they have any new or additional input beyond what has been submitted to date. The ISO plans to bring this proposal to both the EIM governing body and the ISO board at a joint meeting that will coincide with the EIM governing body's next scheduled meeting on June 28th in Salt Lake City. And with that, I'd like to open it up for any questions.
Thanks, Peter. As a reminder to folks, please press #2 to enter the queue. No one in the queue currently, but we'll give folks just for any questions that pop up. All right, great. Looks like we have a question that popped up. Operator, if you could please open up the line.
Hi, this is Laura Trelise from the Public Generating Pool. And Peter, thanks so much for going through all of that. And again, just want to thank the ISO for all of your efforts in this process and all the collaboration with stakeholders. It's really appreciated. One of the questions I had on the new sector definition on the pending EIM entity sector is I was just wondering as far as the timing on how that works. I know, for example, BPA is in process. Obviously, they fall under that sector. And with the timing of their signing of the EIM implementation agreement, once they sign, if they sign, then do they just move to the EIM entity sector and then the publicly owned utilities move to the that are within their balancing authority area move to the other sector? Or that was one of the things that maybe was a little bit confusing because the timing is such that they fall into different sectors just within possibly even the next couple months.
Okay, yeah, this is Bert Gross. I can take a swing at that one and see if others have anything further to add. Yeah, the charter does not try to be that prescriptive in terms of timing. You know, it does seem possible that a individual member could change status during the time period when they're going through the nomination and selection process. I think our thinking was that probably they would continue if as of the time when we first start the sector work and start the sector nomination process, if an entity falls within a given sector, they would probably stay within that sector throughout the process, because it would be a continuity problem if in the middle of the roughly 2-month process so I think that's what we would recommend, but it's not. We didn't try to be prescriptive in what we said in that regard. Ultimately, I guess we're hoping the sectors would be able to work that out, but that would be the most logical approach is, you know, to if you're in a given sector as of the date when we start the sector process, you would probably stay in that sector. I don't know if others have comment beyond that. Nobody seems to. So I think that's
okay.
Our thinking at this point.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. Operator, next caller, please.
Hi, this is Jennifer Gardner with Western Resource Advocates. My question is regarding the change to the voting status of the body of state regulators. I think as I was reading this latest iteration of the straw proposal and the charter, I think it became clear to me that, you know, the reason for removing that voting role, or actually for not providing a voting role for the EIM governing body rep as well as the CAISO Board of Governors rep on the GRC is simply because of a conflict of interest, right? I mean, those two bodies will eventually be making a decision on the GRC's final proposal, and so that makes a lot of sense to me. What was a little bit less clear was the decision to remove the voting role for the body of state regulators representative on the GRC. While they're in a decision-making role at their commissions, they won't actually have a decision-making role over the GRC's final proposal. So there doesn't seem to be a conflict of interest there. So I'm curious if there was another reason for removing that voting role for the boss or representative on the GRC, and if so, if you could just clarify that. Thanks.
Well, Jennifer, thanks for that great question. It was definitely something that we looked through. And we did have discussion with the leadership of the BOSSER before we proposed any of these changes. The commissioners are kind of in a unique position where they actually have trouble representing the states that they're within or the common viewpoints of the BOSSER themselves, and thought that this would actually give them more latitude to serve in that advisory capacity and really offer their own opinions versus that of the whole body of state regulators if they did maintain this non-voting status.
Gotcha. So it sounds like there was agreement from the BOSSER itself regarding this non-voting role.
That is correct.
Okay. Thanks, Peter. Appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome.
All right, operator, I'm not seeing any further questions on my end unless you're seeing something on your end. All right, well, thanks so much, folks. As mentioned at the beginning, you can look out for the recording for the session to be available for the next couple of business days. And thanks so much for your time and for joining us today, and please have a great rest of your afternoon.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using AT&T Connect Event Services Enhanced. You may now disconnect.